Hello, everyone. Welcome. Folks are just adding into the webinar right now. We'll get started in just a minute or two. Thanks for joining us. I hope everyone is safe from the earthquake and 9 minutes away tsunami. All of us are safe, so we're continuing with this webinar. But if at any point someone needs to step out, we have full understanding for that. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. We'll get started in just like one more minute as the queue starts to fill in. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm seeing the participant list click up. So once that slows, we'll go ahead and get started. And we'll start just in a little less than a minute. So thanks everyone for being here. And for those that just joined, we'll be starting just in a moment. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for being here on this auspicious tsunami earthquake day. We are excited to have you here at a TechEquity event to talk about AI and housing. I'm really excited to introduce you to our panelists. Before we jump into everything, I'm going to do a little open on our housekeeping, who we are, in case you all have not joined us for an event before or haven't met us before. So to begin, my name's Sam Gordon. I'm Chief Program Officer here at TechEquity. I'm really excited to be in this conversation. Today, we're going to really focus on not just the intersection of AI and housing, but how AI-powered tenant screening is impacting renters. To give you a sense of who we are at TechEquity, you can see here on the slides our vision and our mission. Essentially, at TechEquity, we're interested in addressing economic equity issues, both inside the tech industry and those that result from the tech industry's business models and products and practices. And we tend to focus primarily on two main drivers of the economy. So where we live, housing, and where we work, labor. And we do a variety of things, including research, which you'll hear some about today. We do public policy and regulatory engagement. And over the next 3 years, we are intending to focus more and more on implementation and enforcement. So not just passing good policy, but making sure that regulators, agencies, tenants, folks on the ground, workers have what they need to ensure that those laws are being enforced. So before we get into today's conversation, just a couple quick things on housekeeping. One is we use a code of conduct for our events. Our community manager, Herman, will drop that in the chat. It basically just says, please be respectful of other people's opinions. We open for a Q&A at the end. You're also free to chat in the meantime, but please, just be adults, be kind to each other. And then second is, like I mentioned, we'll have Q&A at the end for our panelists. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom so that we don't miss any questions in the chat. And we will be recording this. The recording will be shared out via email after the event. Okay, so I think those of you that I know that are on the webinar, some of this will be familiar to you, but for those of us that are new to us, we issued a set of AI policy principles at TechEquity that really say 3 high-level things, and this has guided our research and our policy engagement on the intersection of AI with housing and labor. So first is that we believe that the people who are most impacted by technology need a clear and meaningful role in shaping how that technology comes into their lives, and that we can do that through public policy. We can do that through other models in the workplace and in housing, by workers and tenants organizing. There's a variety of mechanisms, but our goal is that people who are impacted are at the center of the conversation about how technology comes into their lives. Second is that AI needs to be built without creating harm. So we really believe that it's important that the people that are developing and deploying these technologies have the burden of really proving that their technologies will not create further harm, will not harm our communities, and that should not just be a responsibility rested upon individuals. And then finally, that power and data asymmetries have to be balanced in order for this to work. So that's a longer, wonkier conversation, but essentially saying that all of the sort of data, information, and resources being concentrated in a select few companies or a select few hands is bad for our economy and is bad for people, and that there are clear steps we can take as a community and as public policy advocates to interrupt that and ensure that there's clear competition and a clear set of tools and opportunities for people who are impacted by technology to shape how it comes into their lives. So I would love to move us into our actual discussion. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves, but to give you a grounding in how we came here, today's conversation, like I said, is really going to focus on how algorithms and technology affect tenants' access to rental housing. At TechEquity, our Vice President of Housing Programs, Hannah, along with our research manager, Daniel Geller, have been looking at the intersection of technology and housing for a while. So we've issued research on corporate landlords and how they are using technology and certain softwares to accelerate the corporate ownership of residential and rental housing. We've also issued research on rent-to-own products and what's happening with venture capital-backed housing companies coming into the housing market. And what we're going to talk about today is a focus on algorithmic tenant screening, or automated tenant screening is sometimes referred to. And I know Hannah will get into this more, but we came to this work through campaigns we've done in the past at TechEquity, supporting efforts to pass fair chance housing policies and supporting our communities who were doing a lot of that work on the ground for a long time, instituting new guidance from the federal HUD. And as we were doing that, we started to see the ways in which these technologies were coming in and potentially sort of glossing over those hard-fought and hard-won protections, and that there was no way to really see if the algorithms, if the sort of formulas that were back-ending these systems were following those laws. And so we wanted to really dig in here and figure out what was going on in this environment. And so we have two panelists with us here today to talk about this topic. And I'd love to just take a few moments for them to introduce themselves, maybe starting with Miguel to talk about you and where you're coming from today.
Sure. Hey, everyone. Thanks for taking the time. Miguel Soto. I went to law school to do consumer protection stuff. Been working at EVCLC for the past 8 years. And the topic that we're covering today is near and dear to my heart and to my profession, because unfortunately, we have to help folks deal with the fallout of the current system all the time. Based in Berkeley, help people throughout the state. And so, yeah, happy to share whatever I can.
Thanks, Miguel, and thanks for being here. And big thanks to East Bay Community Law Center for their partnership on this work. Hannah, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Hannah Holloway. I work in the housing program at TechEquity. And I think Sam gave a really great overview of TechEquity's sort of angle into and history with this issue. I guess to expand on that a little bit, TechEquity started working on fair chance housing campaigns at the local level in California, primarily in Berkeley and Oakland. So those were local campaigns to, one, ensure that criminal history was not a barrier or as much of a barrier for folks trying to gain access to rental housing. And we saw a lot of these campaigns sort of come to a fore in the wake of the guidance that HUD put out around 2016, saying that these types of blanket denials based on criminal history were likely to violate the Fair Housing Act. So we worked on those successful campaigns several years ago, but we're starting to see that the ways in which data consolidation and technology were increasingly applied to rental decisions and sort of assessing an applicant's background meant that even landlords might not be aware of how data that was supposed to not come into the rental decision actually were. So we wanted to understand that a little bit better. Who were the companies behind it? How prevalent was this? But also look at the larger world of prop tech and sort of the role of technology in the residential housing space within tenant screening, and also applied to a few other models as Sam laid out, like corporate housing and the role of technology in making corporate consolidation profitable. So that's it at a high level. I know we'll get into all of that a lot more, but yeah, looking forward to sharing more in today's conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. So I'm just going to jump us in. So Miguel, I'd love to start with you. If you could just sort of talk us all through the traditional screening process to sort of set the context for what's happened, traditionally in the past, still happening in some scenarios, and what your clients are facing in the rental system and what types of issues they normally come to you with when it comes to tenant screening or just, getting access to housing in general.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I can give you about a minute or two intro on how the system generally works, including from our client's perspective, and then share some anecdotes from there. So generally when you apply for housing or credit or some jobs, you're usually asked to either bring your own credit report or for permission to pull your credit report or permission to run a background check on you. And as part of those, they'll often ask you for some combination of your legal name, your date of birth, your social security number, your previous addresses, phone numbers, all kinds of other identifying information. So the landlord's going to take all this information to whatever tenant screening company that they like. There's literally hundreds of them. I don't think anybody knows the exact number, including the CFPB, who's in charge of regulating this area. And each of those tenant screening companies, in turn, are relying on different data brokers who are even further behind the screen, more numerous and more opaque. And those data brokers are gathering information about you from all sorts of places: your rental history, your criminal background, your income, your credit history. And not all of these brokers have access to the same information. So two reports about the exact same person can have very different information depending on who your tenant screening company turned to. Additionally, all of these brokers tend to use different, let's call them margins of errors, when they're pulling data about you to put into the report. So for example, a couple of them might be very strict. I only want information that exactly matches this name, all 9 digits of the social, the date of birth, and these addresses. The reality is that that's a pretty small minority, though. The vast majority seem to prefer to be over-inclusive. So they're going to be okay including data where the name is similar, but not exactly the same, or we'll take 7 digits from the social security and are the same, or the house number is the same, even if the streets are completely different, things like that. The error rate that these things introduce is so big that I think it's like in 2017 or 2018, Equifax, TrendGene, and Experian were basically forced to stop reporting a lot of public records on your credit report as part of a multi-state lawsuit. The thing is that neither tenant screening nor background check companies are part of that lawsuit, and they keep doing the same thing these days. So basically, our clients are going into the housing process having no idea what data the landlord is going to be looking at. And chances are, at least some of that information is going to be wrong. And short of being very lucky, they're not really going to have a chance to review and correct that data before the landlord gets the report and makes a decision about whether you can or cannot get housed. Now, some landlords really want to automate the entire process. So rather than asking for a copy of an actual report that they can review, they'll turn to a third party who's going to run that report through their own secretive proprietary algorithm, and it's going to spit out over their recommendation: yes, rent to this person; no, don't rent to this person; or in some cases, a number, higher, better. Like we've seen everything between 0 to 10 to 0 to 100. It's kind of like your FICO score, except here the landlord's not bothering to sift your individual account information. They're just saying, Miguel's applied for housing, give me that number back. Cool, I'm comfortable with a 70 out of 100, or I'm not, and I will not be able to tell you why this number was generated. All I know is that the company that I paid to tell me if you're a good risk has told me that you're not. So our clients usually come to us because they've encountered one of 3 very different types of landlords. The first one is the smallest, and those are the ones that want you to bring your own credit report. And the second one is much more common. They ask for permission to pull your credit report and do that background check. And then the third one are the ones I just mentioned, who ask a third party to do all the screening and spit out that number or recommendation. That first type of landlord that asks you to bring your own report, they're rare, but at least they do give you a chance to explain. They sit down with you and they'll give you a chance to explain, okay, here's your credit report. Why did this account go into collections a few years ago? Or I see an eviction here. What's up with that? And the reason our clients come to us in those situations is, like I said before, a lot of that information is either wrong or it's out of date. Like we've had one client, for example, who said on their credit report when they were applying for housing as an undergrad that they defaulted on a car loan 8 years ago. The client was in middle school. They did not have a car, let alone have it repossessed. And the statistics share that our encounters and our clients aren't really that rare, unfortunately. I think something like about a third of all Americans have an error on their credit report, and something like 5 to 10% have a major error that can single-handedly cause you to get denied housing. For example, we've had literally multiple clients just during my time here at EBCLC who came to us because the credit reporting agencies were saying, this person is dead, which, as you can imagine, came as a bit of a shock to everyone involved. And then another type of thing that this first form of client needs help from us is getting rid of outdated information on the credit report. So the law says that most negative information about you is supposed to go away after 7 years, so you can get a fresh start. But what often happens is that a debt collector will get a hold of the debt, they'll buy it or they'll get assigned it, and they'll choose to report it as a fresh debt. So even though this account was delinquent or defaulted 10 years ago, that's now showing up as something that showed up only 2 years ago, and it's going to stay there. Basically, they've chosen to reset that 7-year clock. We've also seen a lot of data brokers that hold on to records from way before. For example, nowadays in California, most eviction are masked, not all, but most. But we've had data brokers that are reporting evictions from 20 years ago, and those are still showing up on your monitor report because 20 years ago, those records are publicly available, and the data broker is not complying with its obligations and taking that off when it reports back about you. And again, some of those clients that have those ancient eviction records, it's not even them, especially folks from East Asian and Latinos community clients who tend to have a fewer subset of names, tend to get caught up in this more often in our experience. So basically, we have clients coming in with debts and other matters from 10, 15, 20 years ago that are causing problems for them getting housing now, even though the law says all this should have come off no more than after no more than 7 years. And the funny part is that as bad as it feels to have to sit down with your landlord and get grilled about your past, at least these types of landlords give you a chance to explain yourself. That's not common. The majority pull your credit report or your background check without you being around, and then they make their decision. And background checks, like I said before, aren't any more accurate than credit reports. I remember not that long ago, I had a client come in who was denied housing because he supposedly had a criminal background. We checked in with the sheriff's office. He was adamant it didn't happen. We checked in with the sheriff's office. They said, no idea who this person is. We've never dealt with him before. Not an arrest, not a conviction. We took that to the landlord. It didn't matter. By that point, the apartment that he was applying for was long gone. We also had a lot of other non-conviction criminal records appear, and these are supposed to age off of your background report. But again, they don't because the brokers and the tenant screening companies aren't doing their job correctly. So clients are being told, we're not renting to you because of this unspecified thing in your credit or your background history. We're sometimes going to tell you what, but usually not. When we're not going to tell you a lot of the times who's telling us this misinformation. So our clients are basically left trying to fight phantoms to get some housing. And the worst part is even those clients are lucky compared to those who turn to the companies, the third parties who just have that up, down, or rental score people. Because like I mentioned before, those landlords that are turning you down honestly can't even tell you what that score is. They have no access to that information. They have no access to the algorithm behind it. And you can have the exact same person apply at 2 different places, or the 2 different people apply at the same place with the same information, and they can be given very different scores. I'm sure a lot of you know and familiar with the triangle score. I personally get one as part of one of my credit cards every month, and it fluctuates as much as 40 points a month, even though literally nothing has changed. These tenant screening numbers and values, no different as far as we can tell. So the whole system is basically based on some pretty opaque data that's frequently wrong and it's outdated, but it is causing our clients and our tenants to not be able to access housing. And it's all based on information that often they can neither access nor correct like they're supposed to be able.
Thanks, Miguel. I think that's super helpful. And I was just looking at the participant list and I see we have a lot of legislative staffers. So I also just wanted to kind of drill in on a point you were making about the CFPB. So like what Miguel was laying out as these three categories, right? Of like some will sit down with you and help you understand your report. Some are just going to take it at face value. You'll be late. And then others are using this more opaque data system, which I know Hannah will get into because that's where we've spent a lot of time is trying to understand that. I think it's important to suss out that the CFPB has, jurisdiction over the major credit bureaus, so the big three. But they issued a report in, I think, November of 2022 about the growth of tenant screening companies. And they were estimating, to your point, Miguel, they don't know how many tenant screening companies there are, and they technically don't know if they can exercise the same authority over them because if they're not a credit bureau, right, does it extend to them? So CFPB's report said they estimate about 600 of these types of companies have cropped up. The New York Times, and Hannah will probably correct my numbers if I get this wrong, but the New York Times did an investigation on the same phenomenon, and their estimate was there's probably about 1,200 companies operating. So you can imagine for folks that think about things in a regulatory framework, there's somewhere between 400 and 1,200 companies that are dictating whether or not people have access to housing, and they're not facing any regulatory scrutiny on sort of their practices in terms of data collection outside of the fact that they should follow our existing laws, right, around fair chance, hiring, around fair housing generally, for whatever municipalities they're operating in. But as Hannah will get into, these systems are really, really difficult to have any window into. So it's hard to know what data they're pulling and if they're adhering to those guidelines and standards. So Hannah, you started to get into this a bit, but you released research that you conducted with East Bay Community Law Center, but also with folks at MIT around what this technology means for renters and how it's operating, who's using it, kind of what lessons we're learning from what we can find out about it. So I wondered if you could just talk us through kind of the report and some of what Miguel was outlining, what you're finding in algorithmic tenant screening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a sense from renters, from CFPB, from these media outlets, from just what we know about the rental system, that technology and algorithms are playing an increasing role in determining rental access, but it's really hard for all of the reasons that Sam and Miguel outlined to understand like to what extent that's happening, how they're doing it. So we've been trying to figure out ways to understand that, which again is really difficult because of trade secret claims, proprietary algorithms, and the fact that, the landlords are the ones that have this information around who the companies are. It's really hard to track them down if you're not, engaging them for a contract, frankly. But at the beginning of this year, if I have an accurate grasp on time, I think TechEquity decided to run a survey, a third-party survey through a research firm in the hopes that engaging that third party would allow landlords to be a bit more forthcoming with us in their responses. But we ran a survey earlier this year, and that reached 400 landlords, and we paired it with a survey of tenants as well, and that reached about 1,000 tenants, both in California. And our full survey questions are included in the report, which is available on our website. I imagine available in the chat link here as well. But we were really interested in understanding, which consumer reporting agencies, otherwise known as tenant screening companies, landlords are frequently working with, what information they're receiving from them, and really how they use the information they receive from tenant screeners to make their final rental decisions. And then on the tenant side, we asked a lot of demographic questions about age, race, income, as well as their credit, eviction, criminal history, where they applied, what the rental decision was, in the hopes that we could start to piece together both landlord practices and sort of tenant experiences. Much of our analysis actually focused on the landlord responses because, as Miguel outlined, there's just very little information actually shared with applicants around why those decisions were made. So most of what I will now get into on our findings really is pulled from the landlord survey. But I think when we dug into the responses, even we were surprised by how prevalent these decision-making tools are in rental applications, and specifically how they were even more acutely used for some of the most vulnerable tenants and applicants. So we found that almost 2/3 of landlords that we surveyed received tenant screening reports that contained some form of technology or AI generated score or recommendation, as Miguel was describing. So as you mentioned, I think credit scoring kind of brought in this idea of compiling data into a recommendation. It's notable that even HUD has said, there's no proof showing that credit score is actually indicative of an applicant's or someone's ability to pay rent specifically. So we see that kind of introducing this idea of a score, but until recently, even credit scores were also included with the actual information on a renter. So what is their eviction history? What is their rental history? This sort of raw data, you could say, was given to the landlord to assess and come to their own determination. Now with these automated decision-making or algorithmic-backed tenant screening tools, the information from an applicant's raw reports is sort of compiled by a third party that's very opaque to pretty much everyone involved. And they provide their own analysis and their own recommendation in a way that's very much decoupled from again, the reports of the applicant, the information on that actual applicant. So again, almost 2/3 of landlords that we surveyed were receiving that type of third-party assessment, third-party adjudication, and using it in some way in their rental determinations. It's probably also important to talk through the type of information specifically that landlords were receiving. So the most common type of information that they received, we asked about, income verification, credit score, residential history. These are all still incredibly important to landlords, as you might suspect. But we also asked about predictive information. So this is the type of analytic that might give landlords predictions about how likely a potential renter is to pay the rent on time or to break a lease early, even their likelihood for property damage. These claim to give landlords like risk management information about a behavior that a tenant might exhibit in the future. But this sort of predictive analysis that judges people based on, again, actions they have not yet taken is sometimes called social scoring. In the EU in particular, we see it called social scoring, and it was actually recently banned in the EU AI Act. Here, we don't have those protections, so we were curious how many landlords are using it. It was the least common type of information that landlords reported using, but it was 20%. 20% of landlords that we surveyed said, yeah, I'm receiving this type of predictive information. So 1/5 are getting this like aggregated, unproven prediction of future behavior. Another finding that's worth highlighting, in addition to what they receive, I think it's also important to understand what landlords are doing with the information. Okay, they might receive predictive information. Is that one factor in the overall determination? Are they just like taking that and applying it wholesale to the applicant? So the survey asked landlords how they use the reports overall. Do they follow what the screening is telling them to do? Again, is it one factor in their overall decision? And across the landlord sample, 60% are reviewing that screening information, applying some level of discretion, their own sort of decision-making faculties to the final decision. 37% are following what the screening results tell them without sort of another step of their own sort of internal process. They're just doing what it tells them to do. And that figure in particular is really concerning, given, I think, some of what we've talked about here. So in 2016, HUD released guidance saying that, criminal history in particular, when used as a factor for a blanket denial, is likely to violate the Fair Housing Act. And then earlier this year, we saw HUD release new guidance saying that, credit and eviction history poses the same risks. And in particular, it had some call-outs and concerns around the role of algorithms in creating those fair housing risks in particular. So yeah, these figures are concerning. And I think especially in the California context, with 37% just following whatever the screening company tells them to do, that could mean that as many as 2.2 million of the nearly 6 million renter households in the state are assessed in ways that just don't comply with fair housing. And I guess maybe one of the last things, if I have a couple more minutes, I think that this just really underscores the role that technology is playing in circumventing renter and civil rights protections for Californians. The sort of, I think all of our findings are important personally, but the sort of two that I pull out are, the highest prevalence of relying on the screening results and just sort of applying it without your own discretion. When we break down how different types of landlords treat that differently, we saw that the highest rates were among landlords who operate between 1 and 4 units, and landlords who charge rents that are affordable to California households between 0 and 30% of AMI. So 1 in 4 units is what's known as like mom and pop landlords, who are exempted from a lot of California landlord tenant law. And of course, the most affordable rents are where some of the most vulnerable rental households live currently. So we can see that the untested model by these groups, the reliance on untested models by these groups, means that new technology is disproportionately being experimented with on renters with comparatively fewer protections. There's a lot more I can say, but maybe I'll save it for Q&A or the next question.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. I want to underscore some of what you said. I thought you put a really fine point on this, but I just want to say it, is the social scoring. So the predictive scoring, you mentioned that this has been prohibited through the AI Act in the EU. I just wanted to double down on that point, because I know, when we were early on in our research, you were looking at the different sort of tenant screening tools that were popping up. And, one of them is coming to mind was using sort of your neighborhood information. It said, plain as day on their front homepage, they were using information about the neighborhood you live in to make a prediction about whether or not you will be a quote unquote good renter, which is both social scoring, but a very clear proxy for race. And things that, I think in, a reasonable person standard might meet that proxy status. And I think that that's really important for folks to understand, that not only are, there guardrails needed around making sure that these technologies aren't creating an individually discriminatory outcome, there's also just the potential for large classes of people to be sort of excluded from housing because of these, quote unquote, analytics that are predicting things that have nothing to do with that person's actual ability to pay rent or, be a quote unquote good tenant. So I wanted to just underscore that. And then also the last point you were making, I think, again, because I know we have legislative staff here, it's really important to note that a large number of landlords in our sample that are mom and pop, quote unquote, mom and pop landlords are using this type of technology. We could assume because it's fast, right? Easy. You just pop in a Google search, I need to screen this tenant, and some VC-backed company pops up on your ads and you can just fill it out there, right? But I think that really means that we need to be critical and thoughtful about how we draw our policy lines. And who we're covering, because if our most vulnerable tenants are subject to these types of technology and they don't have any real recourse and there's no real transparency, and we're exempting those landlords from coverage on any sort of transparency and recourse that tenants would need, that feels like a mismatch. So I just wanted to like pull those points up. And I think connected to that, I know you mentioned this, Hannah, but the tenants had a hard time sort of describing who the screening company was. Most tenants didn't get a copy of their report. Often they don't know that this technology is being used, that they're subject to an automated decision-making system in any way. And so, the tenant experience is telling us very little about the technology. And this is true, I will just say, across sort of the technology stack, is like, this is one of the hardest parts, is people don't know they're being subjected to this, right? It often takes frontier research, whistleblowers, all sorts of stuff. And so one thing that I think is hard for people to wrap their minds around is that this is playing a growing role in their access to housing. And I know we mentioned earlier, Miguel, you and East Bay Community Law Center, you worked with TechEquity on early attempts at this research, and it was designed to survey tenants directly about their experiences. And I wondered if you could talk to us about kind of why trying to understand the issue that way was challenging, and what you think tenants actually understand about this issue or don't understand about this issue.
Yeah, sure, gladly. I think you guys probably share this perspective, but the problem with asking the tenants to explain what's going on is it's kind of like blindfolding somebody and then asking them to describe what they see. The tenants just don't have access. They have no knowledge of what's going on throughout the process. And even when they try to find out, they're frequently shut out when they want to find out, well, where did things go wrong. So in addition to talking about the things we said about before, all those hundreds of tenant screening companies, how every landlord does it differently, how there's these brokers that are even further removed from the whole process. The law really only allows tenants to find out if they're being denied housing because something on their credit report after they've been denied. So this is unlike employees, for example, who get to learn about the reasons before getting shut down. All the federal law requires is that if your landlord denies you because of something on your tenant screening report, you got to get sent this adverse action notice. So number one, a lot of landlords don't actually follow through and give you that. Number two, this notice is pretty vague. It's going to have some very generic, it's 1 or 2 pages, usually just one, got very generic reasons for denying you. We had one client, for example, that was told he couldn't get housing because he didn't have enough credit history to rent a place, but he had several years of good credit score over 700. So that didn't make any sense. And even when the clients know that they are entitled to this notice and they ask for it, what they get doesn't describe a thing. Like what information we were talking about before, what went into this? How do I fix your misunderstanding of what's going on? So in employment, if you get denied, that happened, you can be told beforehand, you also get a free copy of your report. Tenants don't get that. You have to track it down yourself, and you've got a limited time window to get a free copy. A lot of these tenant screening companies also refuse to give you a free copy, even if you're within that 60-day window, or you're in theory entitled to a free copy of your tenant screening report every year from any nationwide company. A lot of them don't take the position that, like you said before, we're not a credit reporting agency, so none of those rules apply to us, and you'll never get to see what we're saying to others about you. And even if the tenant does get the papers, a lot of them don't understand it. I think Hannah touched on this, but we've got clients who come to us thinking like the landlord is the tenant screening company, because I gave you my data, I gave you my information. I don't know who Rental Express is. I've never heard of them. I never dealt with them. And they certainly, the clients, certainly don't know who the data broker is that's providing all this information. That's even more removed from the tenant's world. Basically, tenants just generally don't have an idea what's going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of barriers that are actively trying to prevent them from getting a peek behind that curtain. And then a lot of clients are just generally misinformed about how the process works to begin with. I remember we had one client that came in not that long ago. She was denied housing because of a non-existent lawsuit that was supposed to be appearing on the credit report. But when we asked her, like, well, did you pull it? Did you see it? She's like, no, because if I pull my own credit report, that's going to cause my credit score to go down. It's going to make it even more hard to get housing. So basically, the tenants, unfortunately, due to the way the process works, are probably they're the most impacted, but they're the least knowledgeable about what the process is.
Absolutely. Thanks, Miguel. And I think this is something that we've tried to really stress is both with tenant screening, but a lot of sort of automated decision-making systems, tools, and their use, whether it's in housing or employment or healthcare or education. The people who are impacted by them have very little visibility into what's happening. What was it about, to your point, Miguel, their personal information? What was the logic behind that decision? How was my personal information used? There's very little transparency and so very little ability for people to enact even their existing rights because they don't know what's happening. And I think that for policymakers, that's a really important nuance to understand because I think our policymakers, our elected officials, they're very used to dealing with harms after the fact. There's a massive uprising, people are pissed, we're going to go legislate something around it. But this technology requires that lawmakers are up to date on how it's spreading in the economy and what its likely impact is, because the people who are impacted do not know this is happening and often do not have the information they need to even get up in arms about it. So I just wanted to note that this technology actually requires an ex ante approach to setting guardrails up versus an ex post, because ex post, like once everything's out, it's there, like you were pointing out, folks are dealing with records from 20 years ago that data brokers aren't cleaning up. So we want to really interrupt what's happening. And I think this is a good segue because I know we have a bunch of questions in the chat, but I want to just give both of you a chance to say, like, given all of this, what do you think should or could be done with California's existing, sort of legislative and regulatory opportunities? What are the steps that would make sense to deal with some of the outcomes of this? And, in particular, Hannah, maybe we'll start with you. I'm curious sort of like how you would answer that, and also just how you would want people to understand sort of the scale and speed of these technologies and why they're particularly problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an existing model, as we mentioned, the 2024 guidance from HUD on the use of sort of advanced technology in the rental screening process. So we've outlined some of what that guidance covers, but I guess at a high level, it's sort of applying some of the previous guidance around criminal history to more factors, more sort of like tenant background factors such as eviction histories and credit histories. But then it's also calling for certain practices around the use of technology in the rental screening process, calling for model validation. Right now, that's not required at all of these companies. So model validation of the companies, explainability to the landlords, and also, I think importantly, the wholesale sharing of any information that's collected on a tenant and provided to a landlord in relation to a specific tenant's application. That information has to be shared with the landlord and shared with the tenant so that they can at least start to piece together what's happening to them in these processes. We're under no illusions that guidance will stand in the next administration, and there's a real need for states and localities to to step in and shore up those gaps that might be coming down the pike for us. There's precedent for that in California in the wake of the 2016 guidance. There was regulation within FEHA that adopted those protections and those recommendations at the state level. So I think that I know we're at time, and there's probably questions on this too. So yeah, I'll just say that there is a role for the state and localities to play in adopting and codifying those recommendations to ensure that we're trying to get out ahead of this to the extent that we're not already out of the gate. But I'll stop there.
Great. And before we open for questions, Miguel, I don't know if you have a minute or two, anything you wanted to add before we open it up.
No, I'm a bit of a radical when it comes to the solutions phase. So this is probably not going to go over super well, but my vote, just don't allow these things to be used at all. We've got decades of experience to tell us that, number one, credit reports were never designed. The credit reporting system was never designed or targeted towards tenants. They've been asked several times, the tenant screening companies, what evidence do you have that these reports actually make it more likely that a landlord's going to have a quote unquote good tenant? None. And even just using a credit score makes no sense, because there's that old saying that's completely true in our experience. Housing eats first. Basically, when our clients come to us because they have $2,000, they got to stretch over $2,600 worth of expenses, the advice is always the same. Prioritize the following things, but number one is keeping that roof over your head. So a lot of other thoughts, but I know we're got a Q&A session, so I'll shut myself off there.
Yeah, well, I like that. I like that response. That makes sense to me. I want to invite Marian Wellington, our Director of Communications, to help facilitate what looks like a lot of great questions.
A lot of great questions. So thank you everyone for putting them in there. And thank you, Miguel and Hannah and Sam, for such a good conversation. We probably won't be able to get to every question. So apologies if yours doesn't get answered, but we will do our best. Okay, so the first question, and I think Hannah, you touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear from both you, Miguel and Hannah, of what kinds of communities are most particularly vulnerable to these types of harms about the tenant screening, and then also what kinds of landlords are using this sort of technology.
But Hannah, I think you probably have more information on this than I do.
Yeah, I mean, based on the research that we did, the communities that are most at risk are the communities that are most at risk in sort of the current, and even you could say like the analog rental market. So in our tenant survey, we also found that Black and Latinx applicants were more than twice as likely to be denied as white applicants. Importantly, that's not a causal link, because the tenants that we surveyed were not like attached to the landlords that we surveyed, if that makes sense. But I think it does demonstrate that in this rental market where we are seeing pretty widespread use of tenant screening AI, these are the communities that are being disproportionately impacted by it. And then on the landlord side, as I mentioned, I think it's what we saw, which we frankly found surprising, although I think that there are certain explanations for it. What we saw is that small mom and pop landlords were the most likely, or more likely, slightly more likely to rely on tenant screening results, and then also landlords that are charging more affordable rents. So, and I should mention that we're in the process of analyzing comparison surveys that we conducted in Georgia and North Carolina as well. And so far seeing really similar results overall, but also on the small landlord side of things. So that could be a matter of, yeah, just it being sort of a job on the side of other things for these landlords. And so they're outsourcing those decisions. Who knows what, but it is small landlords, landlords charging more affordable rents who are relying on it, and Black and Latinx renters who seem to be bearing the brunt of it, as we saw in our research results, at least.
More to add that, Hannah's got obviously the bird's eye view, and I can share anecdotally from the ground level. Our experiences are pretty similar, especially, like I said, in the Latino community. I'll give you a personal example. I'm one of 5 Miguels on just my mother's side that lives here in the Bay Area. We are not very original when it comes to names. So I've pulled up my credit report a couple of times, and it has information from some of my relatives, including my dad. And I know they've all done the same thing too. So like I said before, the system's not great, and it tends to impact, I think, folks of color much more than it does other.
Got it. Thank you both for sharing. Okay, we have a couple of questions that I want to kind of smush together, so we'll see if it works. But it's sort of an overarching question of are there pieces of legislation either in California or federally that are already in existence that we can use to apply to existingly regulate algorithm tenant screening? So some things that people have brought up are the 2024 HUD guidance, like if that has held any water. If we could use the Fair Credit Reporting Act as a way to address these issues. And then kind of looking forward to if the upcoming regulations on automated decision-making from the California Privacy Protection Agency, if any of those come into play either now or hopefully to come.
You want to go ahead and take it first?
Yeah, yes, I would say yes to all of the above. These could all be ways to address the role of technology in rental screening. The HUD guidance came out in April, if I'm not mistaken, maybe in May. And to my knowledge, I don't think it's been codified or applied in other areas, although I do think and hope that we will see that change in the coming months, in the coming years. And then I do think that there are potentially ways in with the Fair Credit Reporting Act or FCRA, things like the adverse action notices could be a potential way that we could see getting more information into the hands of renters, the companies that are providing screening results, the reasons that, that the adverse action was taken. This could be information provided in those notices, but currently isn't, as Miguel mentioned, and as we saw in our first attempts at research, those are just so high level. There's no real meaningful anything we can pull from those right now, but there could be, you know, potentially regulatory action to require more and greater information in those. So that could be a way, but I do want to underscore a point Miguel made, which is just that, like, even when this information is shared with renters in those few instances, it's not always legible or understandable. And so I think that that really needs to be a focus as well. So if it were tackled through sort of like disclosure and transparency, I think a focus on explainability would be necessary too.
I was
Yeah,
just going to add,
sorry.
oh, go ahead. Sorry, Miguel.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to add that, you know, I would say our opinion on this, not just in housing, but in most contexts, is that a very clear right to explanation is really, really important with these tools. And it can't, you know, Hannah and I did our own little experiment using the existing sort of rights under the privacy agency here to see what information these companies were collecting on us. And when you collect, you know, essentially a version of your consumer file, what you could get, you know, to some extent through FCRA, but also through CPPA. It's just like, I mean, Hannah, what was it for each of us? Like 30 pages of just like indecipherable data point. Some were right, some were wrong. It would be really, really difficult to understand what of that data was pulled into a decision about me and how much did that weigh into the logic. And so I would say this is one of the most obvious, most critical, most urgent things we could be doing is making clear that companies have to give you a right to explanation when it impacts critical parts of your life, like housing, like hiring, like healthcare. And that explanation needs to be tailored to you. It needs to include your personal information. It needs to include what logic was used and how your personal information was used in that sort of logic to make this decision, what role humans had in making the decision. And you need to be able to have that information in order for all of our existing rights to work. Our rights that we have are nothing if people don't get that explanation. So I would just forcefully double down on that.
I agree there's a lot of room for improvement, and I just want to focus on FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, for a second. It's weak, to be blunt. Even if we just want to tinker around in there, we can start by making it easier for tenants to at least see the same information that the landlords are looking at when they make their decision. At the very, very minimum, give us the same sufficient protection that an employee gets when it applies. But we also, and if we were to stick within FCRA, we also got to make it a lot easier and faster to correct misinformation. Because right now, as a practitioner, I can tell you I'm frustrated with FCRA all the time. It takes weeks to fix misinformation, if it's ever fixed at all. And my standard go-to with clients when it comes to fixing something on the credit report is brace yourself for a multi-month process, because that's much more normal. And that's assumed it doesn't come to a lawsuit in the first place. I mentioned before, we've had clients, plural, who are being reported as dead. Those took months to fix. You would think a simple pulse and an ID would be enough, but nope, not so much. And the truth of the matter is we're in California. Like, an apartment does not stay on the market for months while I'm trying to hunt down whoever's telling the whole world that they shouldn't rent to me because my date of birth is kind of close to somebody that's on a terrorist watch list. It's not practical. And well, I got a soapbox and I'm writing my letters to Santa. I'd also like to make it a lot easier to punish the bad actors, both in terms of the process and the penalties, because these companies are ruining lives. They're making people homeless. They're giving out wrong information, all just to have the bottom line. And we're talking, some of them that automate the process are spending 22 cents per review, just because it costs $7 to have a human look at it. I know we're charging you $25 for a report, but the more I spend to make sure that you are who you say you are, and that this eviction lawsuit is actually, you know, close and spelling to your name, the less money I have to pocket. Until we stop that bottom line thinking, we're not gonna. We can tinker around the edges all we want, but we're not gonna fix it. It's just too profitable to do it wrong. And until we make it more expensive to do it wrong than just do it right, then they're just going to keep doing the same thing. It's not like the tenants have any choice in who the tenant screening report is. It's not, that's a decision that the landlord makes. So I want to reiterate that point I said earlier about credit reports, not suited for this thing in the first place. That's my ultimate stance. But if I can't get that pony for Christmas, let's at least give me some stronger tools to make sure that everybody that's in this business is doing things right.
Sorry, one other tiny thing I would add. Someone asked, and this was in your question, about the rulemaking around automated decision-making tools and data brokers that's going on right now at the privacy agency. Folks that are here that work with me will not be surprised to hear this answer. It is very clear that the tech industry is lobbying hard to weaken those regulations. At every iteration of draft rulemaking, the notices, the rights for people to understand what went into that decision have gotten weaker and weaker. So I would say to any advocates on the phone, it's really important that we come together and we make our voices heard in that process so that folks know why getting those sort of notices after a tool has been used, both a pre-use notice to know that a tool is going to be used on you, but then also a post-use or a use notice with clear information is absolutely critical to this happening, because where the regs are going, they are getting weaker and weaker on that point. And to Miguel's point, FCRA is already pretty minimal in terms of what people get. And I think that without engagement, the ADMT regulations could end up in the same boat. And so I would say one is we have to engage there and push back on that narrative that this is too expensive for businesses, to Miguel's last point, or whatever the issue is, because people really, really need it. But also we need legislative engagement, because if we're relying on sort of an industry influence regulation process, we might not get to what tenants really need.
Great. I think we maybe have time for one more question. And so I think you've already gotten into this, but just as a cap, like, what else can we do to better equip for the prospective tenants with information or resources they need in the event that they're trying to push back, renters get involved to increase this transparency and better enact their rights? Did I cut out? Am I cutting out?
But you were saying, I'm looking at the questions. You were saying, like, what resources do tenants need and how can they get involved, essentially? Okay. That's the question, Miguel and Hannah.
Yeah, I'm curious. I would defer to you. Like, I mean, I have thoughts, but I feel like I've shared. Would love to hear your answer.
Got lots of thoughts as well. I will say, in terms of the resources and how to, one of the things that we try to do at our clinic is get clients to understand, like, you've got this issue and it's affecting you, but it's also affecting others. And we want to help you try to resolve your immediate matter and your immediate case, but also we want to connect you with your legislators. I want to connect you with a lot of the folks in this room, because like I said earlier, like right now, the current system's trash. It needs to get fixed. And we're having this discussion. And I think part of the reason, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the reason that I'm in this room is because we're on the ground talking to people that are impacted by this. The folks that are directly impacted by this need to be the ones telling their own story too. I mean, happy to help, but they're the ones that can tell you straight, like, here's what happened. Here's why here's what the current system did to me. Here's why I've been homeless for the past 6 months when I shouldn't be. Here's what I would have needed. Here's what I would have liked, that sort of thing. So connecting those folks with those of y'all in the room would be my first solution. There's a lot of ideas. Honestly, like I said, in my opinion, the current system is so bad, it's so Kafka-esque, that there's almost nowhere left to go but up. But what that looks like can depend a lot on, in my ideal world, getting rid of this whole thing entirely. But when that's not possible, then I want to be creative about solutions, because the sky's the limit, honestly.
Great. I think we are at time. I want to thank everyone for being with us. I saw a note in the Q&A. There were really good questions. I saw someone asking if we could send out responses. We'll figure out what we can respond to and send out. And if we can include that with a recap. But I also just want to invite folks, if you have questions, feel free to pop us an email. We're info@techequity.us, and we're happy to connect you, Miguel, if you're open. I don't want to offer you, but happy to connect you with Miguel too for questions. If there's specific things you want to talk through, we're definitely all ears. And like Miguel said, he is connected to folks that are experiencing really the harms and the outcomes of these systems every day. And we want to make sure that their voices are at the center of the solutions and really shaping what those should be. So let us know how we can help. And thank you all for being a part of this conversation. Thank you, Hannah and Miguel. Thank you, Marian. And thank you, Herman. Thanks, everybody.